The light spread from an LED light isn't as broad as a window or a softbox, especially if your LED has a 30-degree beam spread. My LED panel has a 30-degree light spread, and that's fairly directional. I don't always want a light that's that directional, so I built a disperser from some translucent plastic. I got that plastic at Hobby Lobby. It softens the light a tiny bit and reduces the harshness of the pinpoint LEDs, so it isn't quite as hard for the subjects to look at it. But keep in mind that softness is only defined as the size of the source relative to the subject. So since this isn't that much bigger, it won't be much softer. Here's a test to show the light spread from the flow light. This is without anything to disperse its light. And here it is with the acetate in front of it. The light spread on the wall behind her is spread wider because of that acetate. Here's an image done without the disperser in front of the flow light. Study two things: the shadow edges and the vignetting on the background. With the disperser in place, the shadow edge is a little softer, but it has more light coverage. Just as a comparison, check this out. Even with such a relatively small light, it's still softer and has more light coverage. These relatively small light sources can appear harsh. Now, harsh is not a technical term, but I see it as meaning these problems in portraiture. LED lights have a much lower depth profile, so sometimes they can work in tighter areas than a softbox would. It was my best option here. I tried bouncing flash off the wall, but I ran into some other problems, so the flat LED came to the rescue. I dialed the power on the light so that it visually matched the background. This overhead diagram shows where the next images were done. I used an LED panel as a front profile light and another panel to light the wall behind her. The profile light needs to be done very precisely. It can be moved forward or backward a little, but its intensity needs to be done just right. Being able to see it live makes all the difference in the world. This shows what happens if we miss it. With relatively small lights, we have to be more precise than if we used large lights. A 12 by 12 panel is sometimes harder than I'd like. So when I'm inside a home with white walls or a white ceiling, rather than aim the light directly at the person and settle for the relatively hard light that the small panel produces, I can bounce the light, and being able to see its effect allows me to have a softer light with more coverage. This was the final image that I had in mind. Can you imagine how hard light would have ruined it? I want soft light with a soft concept. If the light from an LED panel is too focused, kind of like a spotlight, you can change that by bouncing it off of a wall or ceiling. That makes the light appear larger to the subject, which in turn makes it softer and lower contrast because now its light spreads and reflects off of everything. This image was lit with the 12 by 12 panel aimed right at her. This was done by aiming the light at the ceiling. Once again, you can see the softer light with lower contrast. Mixing colored lights can be a tricky thing. Generally, it's not advised. And I'll show an example of where it didn't work. Starting with the light on her piano, I thought this was a good idea, but the contrast was excessive. They had a daylight balanced lamp fixture nearby that I turned on, but I don't like that blue with the yellow. So I replaced that daylight bulb with a warm soft white bulb. I photographed this girl on a dark, overcast, misty day. So in order to get the outside area to render as light as we want, we have to either increase the ISO or lengthen the shutter speed. But that also means any inside light will be more exposed. To our left, the kitchen light was on, and we can see that warmth on the shadow side of her face. And by the way, any such ambient light will show up more on the shadow side of a face, because the main light will usually overpower any contamination on the main light side of the face. We turned off that kitchen light here, and you can see the cleaner result with no cross-color problems. Sometimes those room lights aren't obvious to our eyes, so we have to remember to look for any room lights left on and decide whether or not they will add or detract from the final result. I'll show two images that were done in the same place, but how the lighting altered them quite a bit. This is a window light image, and the color balance was about 5800 degrees. And on this one, I used a warm spotlight. When we neutralize much of the warmth from the main light, the background will turn blue, since 5800 degree lighting is cool in comparison to 2800 degree lighting. Now we'll focus on a few methods of accomplishing fill light indoors with LED lighting. When using a small light, we can reduce its harshness with lower contrast, so it's not as apparent. We can add fill light with a light, a reflector, lengthening the shutter speed for an increased ambient fill, or reducing the main light intensity. All of those reduce the diffused value to shadow ratio. Let's see what a light compared to a reflector does for fill lighting. A window light here provided the main light, but we have too much contrast. We need to fill in those shadows. I placed an LED here for fill light. By the way, be aware that with a relatively small light like this, if we place it on the same side as the main, it'll cast a deeper shadow where neither it nor the main light will see. So technically it's not ideal as a fill light. A fill light should fill in the shadows that the main light causes. So I placed an LED light slightly to the right side of my camera and simply dialed it up until it looked to be about the right amount of fill. Next, I placed a reflector as far forward of her as possible, while still giving her the same amount of fill lighting. The differences are subtle, but you can see it, and those differences are due to the sizes of the fill devices and their direction from the subject. Here's a visual image of the setup that we'll be showing. Using an LED light and a reflector for fill, we can adjust the amount of fill by turning or feathering the LED light away from the subject and toward the reflector. This reduces the amount of main light on the subject, but increases the amount of reflected fill light. Continuous lighting makes this very easy to see the results live. With flash, we'd either have to meter it or shoot in chimp. This image was done with the reflector in place, but the LED light was aimed at the subject, not the reflector. As you can see, the light ratio contrast is very high. Aiming the light about halfway between the subject and the reflector brought in some fill light. Aiming the light even more toward the reflector produced a portrait with very low lighting contrast. With high key, a viewer's eye tends to go toward darker objects. So I tend to want a low lighting contrast to keep the viewer's eye attracted to the face, not to the dark shadows. Note also that the background got a little brighter looking. This is because the main light was aimed away from the subject, meaning the camera had to give her more exposure. So the background, which stayed the same exposure, looks brighter because the shutter stayed open longer. And finally, with high-key photographs, our eye is drawn to dark areas. So I lighten the dark parts of her hair and the background. Now when I do this, I ask which way the client wants it, and they have always picked my choice.